Hello, lovelies. You're listening to episode 27 of the Broken Enchantments podcast, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. That's me. I hope you enjoy this episode, and I would love to connect with you on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. You can check out the links below. Now let's get to the story. Karile kept arguing, and before Janir quite knew what was happening, they had left the royal palace. She still wasn't sure how he had talked her into the streets, but now they were making their way among the tradesmen and merchants of Saaradan. No one had challenged them or made an effort to stop them as they slipped out. Altogether, it was uncomfortably easy, despite her annoyance and her keen awareness of Armandius's warning. Curiosity egged her on. That room of hers had started to feel cramped, uncomfortable. It felt unacceptably good to see somewhere besides the palace. The sun bathed the whole of the city in a warm glow. People went about their business and everyday lives. Children played in the streets, women chatted as they hung the washing, men laughed rowdily as they chopped wood. The scene reminded her of the village at Greenhaven, but it had been months since Janir had been home, and the memory felt overused and worn, as if she'd recalled it too often for comfort. Having once again procured his shapeless robe, Karile strut about like a rooster with the finest feathers in the barnyard. "Right before his neck gets wrung," Janir muttered. "What's that?" Karile inquired. "Nothing." "So, you're finally leaving." Karile said it in a way that made her think he knew the answer. "Father hopes it will be tomorrow. The first snows have already come to the further reaches of Brevia. We'll be lucky to reach home before it snows in Greenhaven." Armandius had promised her that he would be coming too, instead of riding to war, though he had not sounded especially happy about that fact. "This war business makes everything else move slower than normal," Karile grumbled. "So, there is going to be a war?" Janir already knew the answer to that, too. "Why else would all 7 High Lords be here? No offense, but you're not that important, my friend." They had reached a gray stone wall. It was about 4 sword lengths high and parted before them to show a walkway into the compound inside. The intricate shapes and designs must have been striking once, but time had taken its toll. The details had long since worn away, leaving one to guess at what the carvings had looked like all those centuries ago. "The Enchanter Temple," Karile announced in an awed voice. She wondered if the residents could sense her, but since no cries of terror rang from within, she assumed not. That was a relief. The one thing the High Lords had agreed upon was that none, not even the enchanters, should know that Armandius Caerson had been harboring one of her kind for all these years. Inside the compound, Janir glimpsed groups of enchanters and enchantresses, with cowls of their robes in varying shades raised over their bowed heads. A second glance at the young novices revealed where Karile had received inspiration for his shapeless garment. Groups of tradesmen, merchants, workmen, and a few well-dressed courtiers made their way solemnly into the temple for midday devotions. Janir and Karile stood to the side of the gate and watched as a young mother tried in vain to quiet the little boy darting around her skirts. "They're on their way to prayers," Janir remarked, moving to turn away. She glanced back to see that Karile hadn't budged. "Let's go," she beckoned impatiently. "Come on, Janir," Karile coaxed. "You strike me as the pious type." "I beg your pardon?" It so happened she had never missed a mass back home, but this was not home. "I'm not going in there." In a hushed tone, she added, "Has your frail brain forgotten why it's called the Enchanter Temple? My kind are the least welcome in there." Janir had seen firsthand what an Argatalum could do to the magically gifted. Her brother, Lucan, had claimed an enchantress no more than a child, and robbed her of her powers. Most enchanters, clairvoyants, and seers would sooner meet death than suffer being claimed. To be claimed would be to lose control of their powers to enemies and still pay the price for using them. If the Argatalum who claimed them wasn't careful, the enchanter could even die. Lucan had used too much of the girl's magic at once and killed her. Janir could still see the child's lifeless body lying on the earthen floor. Karile shrugged, stood on his tiptoes, and whispered in her ear, "I was thinking that maybe someone in there would know something about who wanted to buy the Key of Automatons." Janir groaned. "Karile, that doesn't matter anymore, and if I get caught in there, they'll kill me. No questions." "Not sure how," Karile scoffed. "It's not as if they could use a death spell on you, is it? Just say that you've been feeling burdened by the sins of your race and want to repent. That's total fumets." "Then lie," Karile sighed. "It's a time-honored and glorious tradition. The issue of what to do with me is tense enough as it is without getting caught sneaking around the Enchanter Temple. If you want to go in alone." "How many people do you see going in there alone?" the Enchanter quipped. He had a fair point. Everyone was with someone, whether it was mother and child, family groups, or courtiers with their servants. "Still not going?" She snapped. "Figure it out on your own. Don't you think if someone knew, they would have told the High Lords by now? They would want the Argatolums to succeed even less than we do. What if they tried telling everyone, but no one could understand?" "You're being ridiculous." "Please, Janir, it's important. Just—" "Is there a problem, young sir?" Janir's heart almost skipped as one of the wimpled nuns approached Karile. The nun's magic was burning, almost blazing. She must be exceptionally powerful. Already Janir had seen how easy it would be to get past that magic, shove it aside like a gnat. This woman was strong enough. She should have nothing to fear in the world, save for an Argatolum. Victory flashed across Karile's features before he turned a supplicant look to the nun. "My sister here is hesitant to enter your temple," he said forlornly. "She fears she will not be welcome." Janir debated running away, but that would hardly be discreet. Armandius would want her to draw as little attention to herself as possible. How to achieve that? "Oh, dear child." The nun reached out a motherly hand and laid it on her shoulder. "Of course you are." Janir flinched away out of reflex. "I sincerely doubt that." "There are no unwelcome comers to the Creator's presence," the nun said benevolently. "Come," she beckoned. "Come and seek the Father Creator's mercy. There's forgiveness for all sinners, no matter what you may have done." Janir wondered just what she thought Janir had done. There appeared to be a great deal of pity there. The enchantress ushered Janir toward the gate, gently yet insistently. The whole time she wore a sweet smile, and Janir's panic mounted. Karile cast her a cheeky grin when the nun wasn't looking, and suddenly they were being swept along with the others in the crowd. The nun left them with more smiles and plenty of reassurances that Janir didn't hear over her thundering pulse. As soon as the nun disappeared to take her place in the devotions, Janir dragged Karile to the back of the large structure that served as the devotional hall and bent her head like a beggar. Opening the doors and trying to slip out would be too conspicuous, so she would have to wait until the devotions were over. The High Enchanter and High Enchantress each led their separate choirs in a perfectly synchronized elvish melody. The incense was so strong, Janir thought she would suffocate. Despite that, the music was beautiful, but all she could think about was that she didn't belong there among the reverent worshippers. The strength of their collected magic was uncomfortably intense. Janir was certain the power beckoned to her, luring her like a stack of sugared almonds. Or was that her imagination? Did she really feel drawn to it, or was she afraid of being drawn to it? It would just take a pointed finger and a shouted name, invulnerable, to turn even the sweet nun to a warmonger calling for Argatolum blood. Janir was sure of it. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a flicker of motion and a grayish-brown form slip out. Snarling unkind words in her mind, she crept into the aisle and edged out as quietly as she could. Janir hoped that the choir's loud song would at least muffle the door as it thudded closed. In spite of her annoyance, she had to admit it was pleasant to breathe unscented air again. Janir was mildly surprised to notice that there were no guards. An instant later, the light flared into her mind and she realized there was no need for guards. Magic barriers protected everything. Karile had already made his way across the porch that spanned the entrance to the main hall and was slogging over the grassy lawn toward the living quarters. "Karile!" Janir shouted. "Karile, you can't go that way! That's the women's section of the compound!" She raced after him. As she came within earshot, he began explaining himself. "It's also the way to where they keep the diviner." Janir stopped in her tracks. Was the enchanter trying to make this worse? No. She shook her head vigorously. No. You're not going to question the diviner. They'll string us both up. Now let's go. Janir, we have to find out who tried to buy the key of automatons. Janir let off a desperate groan. The power that the key unlocked was destroyed. Actually, according to Lucan, it was now flowing in her veins, but no one knew quite what that meant. Why should this matter? Let's think about this for a moment. Karile spread his hands in a calming motion. It follows that whoever wanted the key was already an exceptionally powerful enchanter, or enchantress, as it is. If they wanted the key, it follows that they want to rule the world. And if they wanted to rule the world badly enough to deal with Argotolums, do you think that they're just going to give up because their first plan failed? Janir couldn't deny the logic of his reasoning, but she certainly denied the logic of his actions. Karile, stop. You might have a point, but this is not a bad idea. This is far worse. This is so very bad, there is no word for it. Karile! Karile whirled around with one half of his mouth knotted in determination. Power-hungry tyrant. Bloodthirsty nuns. Save the world. Let's include our necks in that. Fine, you win, Karile sighed, throwing up his hands. I'll go back with you under one condition. What's that? He cast her a smirk. You have to catch me first. Karile! The enchanter took off in a dash for the complex where the nuns lived and worked. Janir considered letting him go on his own, but found herself speeding after him. Karile headed straight for a large domed building, set apart from the others on the lawn. The foundation was solid stone, rising at least 2 sword lengths above ground. Heavy white curtains draped the many windows. On the side opposite them, there was a path leading to the entrance. Shrubs and blooming plants rimmed the outside in neat patterns. The grounds were deserted as everyone attended midday prayers. Janir saw no one, but there was a great deal of magic inside, and she had difficulty discerning between people and spells. Usually, the shape or the color gave it away, but there was too much overlapping magic for her to be sure. Janir considered what the consequences would be for breaking into the diviner's holding chamber, then dove for Karile. The early autumn greenery cracked and snapped under their weight as Janir seized the hem of his robe and jerked him into the flower beds. Without a word, they grappled and struggled not a sword length from the diviner's chamber. Karile fought to shove off her hands, and she battled to pin him down. You're not going in there, Janir grunted, catching Karile by the ankle. Yes, I am, he retorted, shaking her off and scrambling for the dome. Karile! She dove for him as he clambered up the side of the foundation. Janir cursed, wrapping her arms around his waist and jerking down as hard as she could. They landed in a heap. Karile smeared moist dirt in her hair, and she shoved a handful of it against his face. He batted at her, and she yanked on his nose. Wriggling away from her, Karile popped to his feet, sprinted to the dome, and scrambled up the wall before she could stop him again. With a final triumphant grin, he disappeared inside the diviner's chamber. Janir sat in the ruins of what had been a lovely flower garden, wondering what she should do. What would Armandius say to her? Would he say that she should abandon her friend to his stupidity? Maybe. Would he blame her for not abandoning Karile? She didn't think so. With discontented muttering, Janir rose and walked around to the steps. By the time she reached the entrance, she had begun to reconsider leaving Karile to the nuns. At least he probably wouldn't be executed for this. Nonetheless, she marched dutifully up the steps, moved aside the heavy white curtain, and entered. As she did, something slid through her entire body like an oily eel. She decided it must have been the magical barriers, powerful enough that they would have surely stopped anyone but an Argotolum. No magic could stop an Argotolum. Glancing up, Janir found Karile not 2 feet from where she had seen him last. He stood totally motionless. Only his eyes flickered from side to side. Janir cautiously crossed the room and tugged on his arm. Immediately, Karile heaved a sigh and slumped forward. So the magical barriers had stopped the enchanter. Janir let him fall while she stood over him with a disapproving glare. He sputtered with confusion for a moment, then sat up. The interior of the dome was all gray marble and heavy white curtains. It brought to mind the image of a tomb. "These monks and nuns aren't too creative with decor, are they?" Karile squinted up at the ceiling. "Have you seen your own clothes lately? You're not one to talk." In the center of the dome, a veil surrounded a space that must have been 2 or 3 sword lengths in diameter. Slits in the roof let the natural sunlight filter through, and oil lamps hung around the inside of the dome for use at night. As the soft breeze whispered through the chamber, there came a quiet murmuring. It struck Janir that they were in the same room as the diviner. The diviner! Karile's eyes locked onto the veil, and he began creeping across the dome in spite of Janir's sputtered protests. Before she could stop him, Karile made his way across the room. Janir braced herself as he pulled back the heavy drapes. To her surprise, the diviner didn't look to be much older than herself. His completely white eyes stared sightlessly into space as he sat cross-legged atop several pillows in a heavy robe. With fervent zeal, he rocked back and forth, muttering strings of random words. His pasty skin and thin limbs implied he had seldom, if ever, walked in the sun. A beam of unnaturally pale light settled on him from the ceiling, making his drastic whiteness all the more dramatic. "We really should go," Janir whispered, squeezing Karile's arm and tugging him away. "The key of Amatons," Karile said, watching the diviner. The diviner's posture stiffened, and he spoke more audibly than before. He came. Child died, but not sad, he always hated. So alone. Alone." Janir stared as the diviner continued rocking to and fro. She hadn't understood a word of it, except that some poor child was dead. What was that about? "The one who wanted the key." "How do you know?" Janir demanded in a hushed tone. "Because that's how it works. I said something to do with him, and the diviner tells me something I didn't know." As if sensing her next question, he continued. "Come now, every enchanter who's read through basic history knows the diviner immediately sees everything and merely picks the details that stand out the most. At this rate, we'll spend days trying to figure it all out." Janir watched as the diviner continued rocking. He seemed alone. Everyone left him here, all but abandoned as they went off to prayers. Even with her annoyance, pity stirred in her chest. Poor boy. The diviner paused, and his sightless eyes seemed to find her. His gaze made her skin crawl and her scalp prickle, but she had the uncanny sense she wasn't supposed to move. His pale mouth spread into an unmistakable smile. "She-Hawk," he whispered happily. "She-Hawk of 2 realms. 2 becomes none, and none becomes 1. 2 becomes none, and none becomes 1. His voice grew ever softer as he repeated the verse over and over again, fading into silence. The diviner stared at her for a few more moments, then resumed his never-ending rocking and murmuring. As his blind gaze left her, Janir hid a shiver. No magical being should be able to read her, much less identify her. Perhaps it was her imagination, but Janir thought that what he said about her had been more prepared than what he had said about the key's buyer. "You!" screeched a harsh voice from behind them. Janir jumped. So they had recognized her. Now there was nothing that would help her case. The Brevians would have every excuse they needed to kill her. She turned around to face her doom with terror. A nun entered from behind them. A different one than the one who had shown them in. This nun might have been dressed in the demure and modest garb of an enchantress, but her scorching scowl made Janir want to flee. The nun locked her hands on her hips, glaring at them. "You again!" Janir opened her mouth to try and explain, but the nun continued. "I told you never to come back here." "That incident from 2 years ago is ancient history," Karile wheedled. "I'm on pilgrimage, you see. Penance for, my sins." Janir could but guess as to what had transpired the last time Karile was here. She doubted that it was anything forgettable. "Secret? Miros?" cried the nun. "There's no need for them," Karile protested. Before Janir could think of what to do, 2 surprisingly large monks had rushed into the diviner's chamber and seized her and the enchanter. "I imagine that you got in by using some form of spelled trickery, and I don't care what it was, but remember this. Don't do it again." She jabbed a finger into Karile's narrow chest. "As Enchantress of the 4th degree and caretaker of the sacred diviner, I hereby banish you, Karile Kerwin, from ever setting foot in this room again. Throw him and his little friend out." The hefty monks dragged Janir and Karile across the trimmed lawn to the gates of the compound. As they were half carried past, several monks and nuns came out of devotions and shouted angrily in the direction of Karile. They clearly remembered him, even if the one at the door hadn't. Upon reaching the arch of the temple gates, the monks unceremoniously tossed the pair into the streets. Janir clambered out of the dirt of the road and whirled on Karile. "That went well." Karile shrugged as he brushed dirt off his robe. "It went a whole lot better than last time." With a shrug, he added, "At least all the buildings are still standing." Janir blinked at him incredulously. "It's a long story," Karile explained. "The last time my father brought me here 2 years ago, I decided I wanted to be an enchanter." "Why? You really think you'd make a good monk?" She dusted herself off, indignantly straightening her collar. "Well, at least no one expects a monk to sling around swords twice his size." "It doesn't matter how strong an enchanter's body is, Karile shook his head, looking away. "So, anyway, nobody here much likes me." Janir caught herself feeling sorry for Karile. She did not want to feel sorry for Karile. "All that trouble, and what did it gain us? Nothing." Janir swung for the back of his head, but he ducked and skirted out of her reach. "We know that the buyer is a man, that there was a child he never liked, and someone is alone." Karile faced her as he would a provoked lioness, never turning his back. Janir gave another yell and would have made a second pass at Karile's head, had not the angry voice of a man echoed up from the streets. "Karile!" It was Sir Marsarian, Karile's father, if Janir had to guess. In appearance, he was the complete opposite of his son. Despite sharing Karile's foreshortened height, he was broad and bulky, with a forceful presence that dared anyone to defy him. Otherwise, the only thing to declare their relation was the spiky, bright red hair. It occurred to Janir how many Argotolums Sir Marsarian must have killed, having served so long in the garrison at the Norwind Pass. She tried not to think about it as he stormed toward his son. "How many times must I tell you to stop fooling around in the Enchanter Temple?" "Well, maybe if you let me become a student there, like I had asked." "We've discussed this. I told you not until you stop acting like a bloody fool. This little escapade has done nothing to help your case. What exactly happened?" Karile jutted out his lip like a small child having a temper tantrum. He was much braver than Janir would have been. "Your powers are already superficial. Who is this?" demanded Sir Marsarian, jabbing an angry finger in Janir's direction. "This is Janir, and she supports me in wanting to go to the temple." Janir opened her mouth to argue, then snapped it shut. "The Argotolum?" Sir Marsarian demanded, voice dropping secretively. "You are a Kerwin. You want to be an enchanter, and you cavort with an Argotolum." "Maybe I stay around her instead of those buffoons in the night school because everybody else is scared of you." In that moment, Janir was fairly scared of Karile's father, too. "If you would even make an effort, you ungrateful, self-righteous, self-pitying young fool, to see why I don't want you going to the temple." As their argument heated like molten lead, Janir slipped off while they were at each other's throats. She made her way back to the palace and tried to sneak in while drawing as little attention to herself as possible. The guards at the gate questioned those going in far more than those going out. All the same, it wasn't too difficult once she met Hesty, who was all too eager to help. The royal entourage was leaving the next day, but Janir had brought next to nothing, so there was very little of hers to be packed. As Hesty led her down the hall, chatting happily away, Janir wondered if she would ever see Karile again, or if they had just spoken for the last time. Her memory circled back to the diviner, how he had looked at her, his reaction to Janir's presence. It was like he had been expecting her. She-Hawk of two realms, two becomes none and none becomes one. It was a strange verse, and Janir couldn't find any precise meaning for it. She decided that it didn't matter, probably never would, and resigned herself to the mystery. Some puzzles weren't meant to be solved. You have been listening to Broken Enchantments, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. Don't forget to check out my Patreon for early access to episodes, bonus content, and lots of patrons-only freebies. You can learn more at elizabethwheatley.com. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube. I'll see you next time.